And now to our main program. Please welcome to the podium former Supreme Court Justice Faith Ireland to introduce our guest, Judge Jim Rogers.
Good afternoon. Judge Jim Rogers currently serves as the presiding judge of the King County Superior Court. He was elected in 2004 and has presided over many trial cases involving civil, criminal, family law, dependency, involuntary treatment issues, and the like. He served as the chief criminal judge for King County. He's a graduate of the University of Washington in Georgetown Law. He practiced law at Riddell Williams, which is now Fox Rothschild, and in the King County Prosecutor's Office. Prior to law school, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer. The King County Superior Court has 61 judicial officers, 53 of whom are elected judges. Judge Rogers is the boss of these people, meaning that his job is a lot like herding cats. The 61 judicial officers are located in 4 courthouses. Judge Rogers will address today the state of your King County Superior Court, the incarceration crisis, where we stand in King County, and current safety challenges at the courthouse. Please welcome Judge Jim Rogers. Jim?
Yeah, our administrative structure has the civilian folks on one side, which I describe as a pyramid, and then my elected co-workers, who I describe as a constellation of stars. So that's the way we work. And I wanted to say, Mr. Edgett, I took your advice. I had 2 children at the same time after practicing law for 10 years, 15 years actually. I'm not sure how much good it did me, but hopefully I learned something from that. Thank you for having us. King County Superior Court. Many of you serve on, I think, jury duty. That's what you think of when you think of King County Superior Court. You think of the many excuses up there in the cartoon that you can see. Every time I go to a Husky tailgate or to a party, somebody tells me about their jury service, and then they ask me how they can get out of their next jury service. I want to thank those of you who have served. It's one of the greatest experiences I think people have as a citizen in our country. It's the most direct experience you'll have judging the cases of your fellow citizens. It's really a remarkable experience. What we think about when we're in court, you'll see the lawyer there saying, why did I agree to try this case? The judge is saying, or thinking, how did this case ever get so far? And the witness is saying, gee, this is neat. Anyway, in the beginning, in 1889, Washington State Constitution created 2 courts, the Supreme Court, which was the Court of Appeals for all cases, and the Superior Court, which is the Court of General Jurisdiction. At the time, shortly thereafter, actually, the first courthouse was in part of Yesler's house, and then it became where Harborview Hospital sits today. That staircase that you may be able to see in your larger blow-up there is near Jefferson, and it was called Profanity Hill, because remember, this is before there were Xerox machines, and you had to carry your briefs, your books, all the way up that staircase from where your law office was in Pioneer Square or downtown up to plead your case. Today we have a very different court. We have 53 judges, as Justice Ireland said, and 9 commissioners who are a type of judicial officer. Since 2014, we have had 39 judicial officers. We've had a change of 60% of our judicial officers. It's incredible for any organization. Most of these people, actually one of these people is no longer a judge. Far right is Judge John Chun, who now serves on our Court of Appeals. I blame the baby boomers for all of this, of course, as I blame them for everything, because they all retired. Today we also have 4 courthouses. We have the King County Courthouse, which many of you are familiar with. We have the Regional Justice Center in Kent, named after Norm Mailing, to the right on the top. We are looking to expand the Regional Justice Center. We are no longer able to hear all of our cases there in our venue line in the South County. 40% of our civil cases in all of King County are filed in the Kent Courthouse, and only 9% are able to be heard there because we're simply out of room to hear the cases. So that's an initiative I'm launching. On the bottom left is a graphic depiction of our new Children and Family Justice Center, named after Judge Patricia Clark. That is a great addition to our courthouses. It's housed right by Yale University, and it also saves the people who are in the current juvenile courthouse from dying in the next earthquake. The old juvenile courthouse was so dilapidated that it was really in need of a change. Our dependency and our juvenile offender cases are housed there. And finally, you may or may not recognize the building on the bottom right, which is Harborview, and that is where we have our Involuntary Treatment Act cases. So we're the court of general jurisdiction for trial courts, and the bottom line is we hear every trial case that is not a small claims case or a drunk driving case. We hear all of the felony criminal cases for the county, from theft to homicide. We hear property disputes, business disputes. Some of you have been in court, unfortunately. We hear all the dissolutions in the county. Oddly enough, though the population in our county has grown astronomically, our dissolution of marriage cases have not increased at all. So apparently nobody wants to get divorced, so congratulations to all of you. We also hear all of the juvenile offender and child protection cases, the dependency cases, and the involuntary commitment cases, the mental health cases. These are people who are in danger of killing themselves, killing another, or cannot take care of themselves. Those cases have increased 100% over the last 6 years. We also hear, of course, all wills, estate cases, guardianship cases, and we are funded solely by the county, not the city, not the state, solely by the county, out of your property taxes. So let me talk about one of my favorite topics. For 10 years, I was a sexual assault and homicide prosecutor, and so, of course, I love crime. So I'm going to talk to all of you about crime and incarceration, the drug wars and aftermath. There's Jimmy Cagney from White Heat, one of the great movies of all time. I don't think anyone questions that we have been in the grips of an incredible drug crisis for 3 decades. It's been going on for decades now. It started in the 80s with the crack wars that gripped our cities, and it takes place today. You only need to walk on the city of Seattle and see the drug crisis. Don't call it a homeless crisis. Yes, there are many homeless people in our area. We should be taking care of them. Many of them are working poor and working, but most of the people that we see certainly around the courthouse, and I see where I live, which is the University District, near the UW, are drug addicts. And it's a terrible problem that we need to, of course, address. But I'm not here to tell you how to address it since I'm a judge. I don't do policy. So let me ask you to consider the approaches to crime prevention on 2 different times in our history. Prohibition and the drug wars, the crime wave. So you all know about Prohibition. You've read about it. You've studied it. It was a time of incredible violence in the United States, although interestingly not in our area, because the liquor market was cornered by a guy named Roy Olmsted, who was a very famous character in the 20s here, who decided instead of guns, he would get fast boats. And he had freighters, he had boats, he went to Vancouver, brought the liquor down. He had a board of directors that included people like Bill Boeing, so he was well funded. So we had not too much of a crime problem, but nationally it was a giant crime problem. This is the murder rate from 1900 to 2013. It's a proxy I'm using for all violence over that time. It's not a perfect proxy, but just bear with me here. You can see the spike in the late 20s, early 30s, around the time of the end of Prohibition, and that other giant spike is the 80s and 90s during the crack wars. The crack wars were more than drug wars. The violence rate went up incredibly high in the 80s and 90s. Murders went from 8,000 to 24,000. Assaults went from 150,000 to 1,130,000. And the number of reported rapes went up astronomically. On sexual assaults, it's not entirely clear whether the rate of sexual assault went up or finally people started reporting them because prosecutors changed their policies. That number is a little bit in dispute. But in any case, there was a lot of violence during that time. Why was there so much violence? Well, one reason is that crack was more lucrative than many other drugs. And there was fights over territory. When I went to Georgetown Law School in 85 to 88, I was a public defender in a program they had during the time. And I remember that the drug dealers sold in Ziploc bags that were color-coded, so you can go back and have quality complaints. It was a highly organized but violent issue. So there was a lot of fear in the 80s and 90s, reflected in the popular culture. I just picked Death Wish with Charles Bronson as one of the many. There was Dirty Harry. It seemed like it was just a time where people were scared. So what was the approach to dealing with this? It was punitive. People believed that there were no possible alternatives to incarceration. The Rockefeller drug laws created a model for the war on drugs. And from 1973 to 2009, we went from 200,000 incarcerated to 1.5 million people in prison. Unprecedented. Look at the little blip to the left there. That's the incarceration rate during Prohibition. And if you look to the right, of course, that's the recent incarceration. Now, here's the two charts that compared, so you can see a little bit that the blip that happened during Prohibition, even though the violence rate was extreme, is nothing like the incarceration rate. Blacks were incarcerated at 6 times the rate of whites, and Latinos 3 times. The increased admission was attributed to drug crimes, but the increased time served was attributed to violent crime. And again, people were scared. There was a lot of violence at the time. And as you well know, we were the nation's leader. 2 strikes, 3 strikes and you're out. We passed sex offender indeterminate sentencing. We were a leader in get tough on crime. Was the incarceration rate partially motivated by racism or a disproportionate result? This is a big topic in criminal justice. Michelle Alexander wrote a very famous book called The New Jim Crow, and James Foreman Jr., son of a civil rights leader, wrote what's probably the best, in my view, book of all this called Locking Up Our Own, where there is an acknowledgement that racism played some part in the drug crime laws, but that even if you released all of the people that were incarcerated for drug crimes, you'd still have only reduced incarceration by 50% because of all the people arrested for violent crimes. Of course, those two are linked, and many of the African American leaders at the time were leaders in trying to get tough on crime. So somehow in the 90s, the crime rate dropped. Social scientists are terrible at predicting when the crime rate goes up and when it comes down. They're always looking in the rearview mirror trying to figure out what happened. And there are a lot of theories as to why the crime rate may have dropped. Some of it had to do with, they blame baby boomers. They said the baby boomers are getting older, not committing crimes anymore. Most of the violent crime was committed by people around 25 years old. More sophisticated policing. Increased incarceration rates definitely contributed to the decrease, but it's very controversial as to what it contributed. And then there's some of the crazier theories like cell phones. No one had to fight in the street because you could just call up and have people come to your house. More people were on happy pills. The end of leaded gasoline. Here's what did not cause an increase in crime. This is going backwards here a little bit, and that's poverty. Poverty did not cause an increase in crime because during the crime drop, we had the recession. And the crime drop kept right on going down into the basement all during that time period. So where are we at now? The crime rate drop is one of the great improvements to American life that we live with now. We still have historically low crime rate. So nationally, many are still incarcerated, and the racial disparity has been enormous, and it's very expensive. And this is leading to an unusual, for our time, right? We're all polarized, liberals and conservatives, but the Koch Foundation and the Arnold Foundation, Cut 50, led by Van Jones, and Right on Crime Coalition, liberals and conservatives agree on nonviolent crime that incarceration rate needs to be dropped. It's too expensive, and it's frankly not clear after being studied how effective on nonviolent crime, I want to stress that, nonviolent crime is where the agreement is, it actually is. King County, for years, in 2000, we were faced with potentially, am I doing okay? Okay. King County was faced in 2000 with having to build a brand new jail. We were out of space in our jail, and there was an initiative led by Norm Mailing, my former boss, one of the great leaders in King County history, and Ron Sims, also a great leader, and many others, to look at how we could potentially look at de-incarceration. The way they looked at it was to provide alternatives, probation, treatment, that were now back in vogue after having been out of vogue during the crime wave. As a result, we for some years have had the lowest jail incarceration and the lowest juvenile incarceration in the United States of America. Now, a little education here on jail versus prison. Prison is when you are sent to the big house for a year and a day or more. And those people typically are much more stable in population because they're staying for a year, they're staying for 5, they're staying for life. Jail population is a little more, this is a terrible analogy, please don't think I'm trivializing incarceration, but it's a little bit like this. If you're staying in jail, you're staying in a hotel. If you're staying in prison, you're renting an apartment for a year. It's much more in and out flexibility in jail population. But having said that, we have the lowest jail incarceration rate in the United States, largely because we've de-incarcerated on nonviolent offenses, and the lowest juvenile incarceration rate, largely because we have a lot of alternatives. So here's the King County jail population. That drop at the end, would you please ignore? That's an artifact. It's not actually data that should be looked at. The top is the national incarceration rate, and the bottom is the King County jail population rate. And I'm going to skip this. That's just showing, that's too hard to read. I'm going to skip that. So the aftermath of the drug wars, we incarcerated everybody. Now where are we at with nonviolent crimes? We've swung the other direction. We're incarcerating nobody. Mr. Satterberg has announced that he's not charging for personal felony drug possession. I think you all know that. That was on the front page of the Washington Post. For some reason, I got less play in Seattle Times. I'm not really sure why. But, and nonviolent defendants are rarely held pre-trial. In Washington state prisons, 75% of the people in your prisons, those are the long stayers, are all violent offenses. Only 6% of them are now held for drugs. So really, we've de-incarcerated on drugs almost entirely. And today in King County, we still have a historically low violent crime rate. But, as you know, we have real problems. We have one of the highest property crime rates in the United States of America. Drug criminal cases are they're usually in an alternative, such as lead, if you had a presentation on lead, where someone's diverted at the point of arrest and taken to treatment, or drug court, which is a fantastic program, by the way. So here's what I want you to take away. The pendulum swung so far that now a lot of people are saying we shouldn't ever incarcerate anyone or arrest anyone on certain kinds of crimes because it causes harm to them. The fact of arrest, incarceration causes harm to them. It's called harm reduction. And what I would say as a judge, for a matter of policy, not a matter of politics, that's for you to decide, is that judges need all the tools they can get because there is no one size that fits all for everybody. We need sometimes the ability to incarcerate somebody. We also need the ability to give them alternatives. We need drug treatment. We need probation in order to be able to tailor the case where it fits. So you may ask, because people are always asking me, what's your reaction to Seattle is dying? And the city prosecutor, that's not my court, by the way, the city prosecutor isn't filing charges. And, of course, Mr. Horsey's talked about the fact that you can shoplift without consequence in a recent cartoon. And my comment is, I'm a judge. I can't comment on these issues. All I can tell you, and in my last couple minutes I'm going to wind up here, is that the problems that I do face with people on the street have to do with safety, getting in and out of the King County Courthouse. Every week to 2 weeks, we have an employee or a juror who's assaulted outside the King County Courthouse, mostly by people who appear to be in the grips of a drug-induced psychosis. There is data that there are mentally ill people in jail, and there's data that 75% of them are mentally ill because of a drug-induced psychosis. 3/4 of them have a drug-induced psychosis. It's a serious problem, and I'm not here to solve it for you today, but I am here to tell you that we do have a great courthouse vicinity improvement committee led by Dow Constantine and Carolyn Whalen. They've worked on cleaning up the courthouse, they've worked on security, but it's not something that will easily be solved. In closing, I'm just going to tell you that every day in King County Superior Court, we adjudicate hundreds of cases every year, thousands of cases. We've heard every case from the Wami massacre in Chinatown to the SPU mass shooting case, that's me in the background, presided over. We've heard the case of Aaron Dixon and Larry Gossett when they were arrested for sitting in Franklin High School, to when Betty McDonald was sued because her neighbors claimed that they were the models for Ma and Pa Kettle in The Egg and I. Ride the Ducks trial, and the Carnation mass shooting. We hope you'll come down to King County Superior Court. I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you have, and thank you for listening to me.
Got a question right over here.
Yes. Sir, where did you serve in the Peace Corps, and how did Peace Corps service influence your current profession?
I served in the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone in 1982 to 1984, which is a small West African country that later became infamous because of its civil war. And I went in to get recruited, or I did try to get myself into the Peace Corps, and they said, well, what have you done in the past? And I said, well, I drove a truck on a wheat ranch, which I did near Pendleton. They thought that was qualification for growing rice in swamps. But that, of course, had a tremendous influence on me, and just in the sense of, I guess, getting to know people that were different than I was. I lived in a small village by myself in a chiefdom with hundreds of people all around, and got to be good friends with many of them.
Okay, we have a question here.
When I was a lad, 75 years ago, in Wisconsin, we had in our county a thing we called the insane asylum. And I think it was. School children would go out and visit it, and the people there were insane. Now, there are people that I think I see on the street who are insane or are close to it. And I just wonder if there's any possibility of getting institutions established to take care of people that have got serious mental adjustment problems.
Yeah, so that's a good question. What happened was that those institutions used to keep people for years without a lot of due process. And in the 80s, the doors just opened and they let everybody out without really a lot of thought as to how to handle it. The new laws that came in really erred on the other side. So often our political system, go from one end of the spectrum to the other, to keep people for a very short period of time when it's even shorter than the medication can become effective, because most of these serious psychiatric illnesses are dealt with medication. There is an effort currently in the last session and the current session by Senator Maka Dhingra, who's the senator from Redmond, to try and lengthen the stay of people to a couple, 3 weeks in order to at least let the medication be effective. And I think that's a fight that will be going on, and I think it's a good idea.
Got one right over here for you.
Thank you for your service and for being here today. A few weeks ago, we had another presenter who talked about the repeated violations by a small group of those that are charged with criminal offenses, and they keep getting back out, and then they keep violating, keep getting back out and violating. How do we address this? I'm most concerned about the problems in downtown Seattle, on the street, as you mentioned, the courthouse, around the Bon Marché, which Macy's, and which is going to leave us. And I have to think that it's still a contributing factor.
Well, I think it is. I assume you're talking about Scott Lindsay's 2 reports on the system failure, which I've read. First of all, I should tell you that those people that are listed in the report are all in Seattle Municipal Court, and the person who prosecutes them or does not is Mr. Holmes, who's not the prosecutor in our court. We have Dan Satterberg. We, of course, have looked at that list to see whether there's crossover, and there are a few people that have crossed over. One of them was released by one of our judges and immediately incarcerated again. He's the gentleman on Como who, on that Seattle is Dying video, who talked openly about how much he loved taking drugs, and then I think he's portrayed in a drug-induced psychosis. We, I think, are hold people a little more with their feet to the fire, but we also have maybe tools that I think Mayor Durkin is trying to enact with more probation. We have some of that already where we can put people in treatment, and if they fail, then they have to go to jail, frankly. But for example, our drug court, which is 25 years old, has over 400 people in it at a time, about 350, but right now they're oversubscribed. And those are all felony cases. Mr. Lindsay was focusing on misdemeanors. And we have about a 60% graduation success rate, which is pretty high for a hardened group of addicts. And that is a model that's national. It's been tested. So we feel like we have real alternatives. There's a split in the community that I deal with. Some people, and I'm just being candid here, folks, since I'm sure no one will repeat what I have to say. Some people believe that treatment is pointless. They actually say that in meetings that I hear. They think that we should just put people into homes, houses, housing, and let them take their drugs. Other of us think that treatment needs to be tried for everybody. You know, at some point it becomes both a choice, but sometimes a little coercion is needed in the front end so people can become sober enough to make a real decision. So it's a serious problem, and I would just encourage that you encourage policies that allow judges a wide variety of options, because there needs to be a wide variety of options to get people into treatment, and if not, then, you know, if they fail, jail's the result.
Okay, we have a question here from Tom.
Thank you. This question is a little beyond King County and Washington State, but I wanted to see your opinion about incarceration as it relates to for-profit prisons across our country. And so some have speculated that because you have an organization that makes money only when it's full, that they do everything they can to keep it full.
I don't really have an opinion on that, only because I haven't studied it. I know that that is out there and there have been articles about it, but we've never had for-profit prisons, or at least during my service in Washington State, and I don't think we would ever have that. So that's not a problem we suffer from.
Question from the back.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm curious about what your thoughts are about safe injection sites.
Well,
Comment, just your thoughts.
no, I'll just tell you. I'll tell you what my duty is. If somebody went to a safe injection site and they were arrested there and they were brought before me and they were convicted, I would sentence them. You know, this is a quandary that judges often face. They have a personal view, but we've got to follow the law. We don't get to choose what the law is and what it isn't. And that was a quandary for people during the drug wars when some people felt like the drug sentences were maybe too harsh. And that's a quandary now when people pass policies that are contrary to federal and state law. They're free to pass those policies, but I have to enforce what the law is as it's written. I don't get to pick and choose.
Okay, we have a question from Paul.
Thank you, Your Honor, for your presentation today. Quick question. Has the legalization of marijuana helped the courts and just everything in general, less incarceration, et cetera, and does that help that curve go down?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is no. It's made no difference because nobody has charged just possession of marijuana in this county for decades. Marijuana got charged on the back of a robbery case or a theft case, or perhaps there was another drug charge. Again, Mr. Satterberg's not charging drug cases anymore, but that was the way it was charged. But for all practical purposes, I was the chief criminal judge for 2 years in King County. I was air traffic control. I saw all the charges, talked to all the people about scheduling. I never saw a marijuana charge, other than added on, again, to a charge of a much more serious nature. So it didn't really make a lot of difference in our work. It may have made a difference in other things.
All right, I've been given the high sign. This is our last question. So we asked Heather Fitzpatrick to deliver it to you. It's going to be a doozy. You ready?
Wow, now I have to live up to that. I
Yeah, you
actually
do.
wanted to start by saying thank you for clarifying that a lot of what people associate with crime in our city is not related to homelessness, but related to addiction issues. It's something we battle. I'm with Wellspring Family Services. We're serving homeless families in our community, and that is definitely not the same population. But the question I have is actually related to family homelessness and what we are seeing in terms of evictions. I was wondering if you could comment on what you're observing in terms of trends in evictions in King County.
Sure. So trends in evictions in King County, those have increased over time, but thanks to the, first with the Seattle Mariner, well, let me give credit to everybody here. King County Bar, the Seattle Mariners and Fred Rivera, and now Microsoft, and I'm blanking on the person at Microsoft who was in charge of that. They have donated millions of dollars in one-time funding for people who are being evicted. And we house those initiatives in the courthouse. So you come in, you can't meet your rent, and they help with one-time money to help keep people in, and they mediate with the landlord. But it has increased. Our judges often struggle with that because they see a case where the landlord has followed the law, person should be evicted, it's a poor family, terrible case, right? But again, we don't really have a lot of discretion. As you also probably know, the legislature is loosening up that so that there's more discretion with the judge. That law will make a difference probably, but I think that the King County initiative will be great for reducing the number of people who, for no fault of their own, or maybe for their fault, but it doesn't really matter to us, miss a payment or miss two payments, and if that payment was made up for them, they could stay in that home. And so we're supporting that. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.